Shalom. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery through the Book of Deuteronomy.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm very excited because we are starting our series on the study in the Book of Deuteronomy. We've not really done this before. For some of you who are, hopefully on your way to work in the morning, you can be listening to this, and we'll hope to cover this in maybe about 10, 12 sessions or so. So the Book of Deuteronomy. Has anyone ever thought about why they call this book the Book of Deuteronomy? Not really, huh? Okay, the book of Deuteronomy comes from the text in chapter 17, verse 18, where it actually says that the king must in the future make a copy of this Torah, right? A copy of the Torah. And in the LXX, which is actually the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was used very, very old, and they use the word Deuteronomion, which actually means a copy of the Torah. And that's how we get the English name Deuteronomy, right? But in Hebrew, they actually call it Devarim. Devarim is, it comes from the first sentence of the book of Deuteronomy. And that, let me just try and see if I can get this up here real quick. Say, these are the words, right? These are the words. Eleh ha-devarim asher devar Moshe. Okay, so these are the words. The words here in Hebrew is Devarim. And that's why they call this book Devarim, right? So this is going to be really interesting. And before we really jump into this, I have a whole bunch of people here with us this morning. They're really quiet, but they're here. Before we really jump into this, I just want to share a little bit from Deuteronomy chapter 31. Okay, we could just jump real quick ahead because I think there's some significance as to why we are doing this chapter at this particular, this book at this particular point of time. So in Deuteronomy chapter 31, there's an instruction that Moses said, right? Verse 10. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, that will be at the Shemitah year, or sometimes some sort of Jubilee year, at the appointed time, in the year of release. So the year of release is the Shana Shemitah, which is the year of Jubilee, if you like, a year of release. And it's so-called because that's the year in which you release people from their slavery, from their debts, and so on and so forth. We will get to that when we actually arrive there. But on this particular year, all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in a place where He chooses, which today would be Jerusalem, right? But back then, they were in the wilderness. Wherever the tabernacle was the place where God chooses. You shall read this law, and that will include Deuteronomy, before all Israel in the hearing. Gather all the people together. So, at this particular point of time, once every 7 years, right? You're supposed to read at this particular feast, the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, there's 7 feasts of the Lord, right? This is one of the Feast of Sukkot. They are supposed to read the book of Deuteronomy among the other laws. And this year, it turns out that Sukkot is September 23rd to 30th, right? So this is really a good time to be reading Deuteronomy because we are actually fulfilling a biblical commandment to do. And, I don't know if it's 7 years, but in our case, it might as well be 17 years because we have never done this before, right? So we are trying to, as it were, to live and walk according to the ways that the Lord has shown us. Okay, so that's really by way of introduction. Also, before I jump into that, Deuteronomy is 34 chapters, is a very long book. The first 11 chapters is mostly the introduction, background, and then from 1 to 3 anyway, and then 4 to 6, you have your core laws. Chapter 7 to 11, you have supplementary exhortations and sort of thing. But 1 to 11 is one whole section. Chapter 12 to 26, you have even more laws, right? And this is really interesting because most of the time we kind of skip over these laws, but we will look at that because they are really, really interesting about how we can look at the details of some of these laws, what they are, some very strange laws, some blessings and curses. And then finally, in the closing of the book, chapters 27 to 34, the final challenge, right? More blessings and curses, life and death, and predictions of the future. So out of that, 34 chapters, very interesting, traditionally attributed to Moses, right? Traditionally attributed to Moses. And by the time you read Deuteronomy, you discover that this is probably Moses addressing the children of Israel after traveling around about 40 years in the wilderness, right? About 14 years in the wilderness, and they were about to enter the promised land. So that's where we are this morning. And I have some friends with me here today who will help me read this. Chapter 1, verse 1.
These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel on this side of the Jordan in the wilderness, in the plain opposite Suph, between Paran, Topel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Ahab.
Okay, you stop there for a second, right? I know it's just the first verse, but there's a lot of things going on here, right? For those of you who are following along, we're using many versions of the Bible actually, but mostly you hear from New King James, NKJV. So if you want to follow along, that would be the Bible to use, but also NASB, which is a very literal and very good translation. I'm actually will be looking at some other versions sometimes, right? But this verse is really interesting because it says, these are the words of Moses spoken to all Israel on. Now, what does your version of Bible says? I mean, some of you are not using NASB, but do you have this side of the Jordan? Do you have that? This side of the, well, that's actually a wrong translation because the actual Hebrew here actually says Ba'ava HaYarden, which means on the other side of the Jordan, right? So if you look at the Hebrew, it's saying that Moses spoke these words on the other side of Jordan. Some of you may be wondering, why does this matter at all? Well, I guess it depends on the authorship, right? The reason why the English translators changed the other side to this side is because they are thinking, well, Moses is the one saying this, right? And Moses never went over to the other side of the Jordan. So the perspective of the writing must be from the Transjordan, all right, which is where Mount Nebo would kind of be today. So if Moses is writing it, he will never say these words were spoken on the other side. See? So the moment you have this one verse, it's just the very first verse, you have a problem in terms of trying to understand who actually wrote this stuff, right? And when was this written? So presumably from the text in the Hebrew, this must have been written at some slightly later date after they've actually crossed the Jordan. And then in retrospect, they're actually saying, okay, this was what Moses said over the other side of Jordan when we were over there at Mount Nebo before we actually came over onto this side. So that I just want to point out that because you will find this particular sort of like, I don't know what you call it, but I guess an adjustment. Okay, the translators are not really translating for you exactly what's in Hebrew. They are making adjustments because they want to help you, or maybe to help make it a little bit smoother in terms of the perspective they're saying. Now, traditionally, Deuteronomy was attributed to Moses, right? Moses was the one who wrote it. But who actually perhaps edited it or penned it down? This is something that scholars debate about. But for the most part, I do take it that these are the words of Moses. They are the words of Moses. Just that here's the small detail, and you may see this going on. Okay, so the place here, the location between Suph, between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth. Hazer means courts. So it's some courts kind of place. According to Numbers 36, verse 13, it says, these are the commandments of the judgments that the Lord commanded the children by the hand of Moses in the plains of Moab, right? By the Jordan across from Jericho. So the stuff that you're reading is Suph, Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth. In Numbers, they give you a different description of the place, different address. Just like someone might say, you guys are, along in Queenstown next to the Fishermen of Christ Church, right? And someone else will say, no, you're in Queenstown opposite of, let's say, maybe the Shell station, right? So different points of reference, but it gives us an idea where this was. And I have actually on the map here, you have, on the north, you have the Sea of Galilee, and down here, you have on the south, you have the Dead Sea. And somewhere here is Ai. So Jericho has to be around here. So this area here, just about this area here, is where Deuteronomy is, I guess the context of story is taking place, all right?
Deuteronomy 1, verse 2. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Now it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him as commandments to them. After he had killed Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who dwelt at Ashtaroth in Edrei. On this side of the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses began to explain this law, saying,
Okay, let's kind of pause there for a while. Okay, in any case, on the map, you can kind of see in terms of the direction. Now, where exactly is Kadesh Barnea? Right? Where exactly? I mean, we read about Kadesh Barnea a lot. That's where they sent out the 12 spies. The truth is, we don't really know exactly where this happened, right? And some people will put it somewhere on this side, right? On the, I guess you could say near the Negev, the northern Negev. Some people place it somewhere on down here. You can see the word near Petra, right? So there's some debate as to where exactly it is because we're not completely sure as to how the people traveled through the wilderness in the 40 years before that. So there's a lot of discussion. And I do have some really interesting maps that you can look at. Elijah, for example, he makes a journey from Beersheba into the wilderness, right? So Paran, that would be like on the, well, it's all in the south area, right? So I'm just gonna ask I wouldn't ask a question, but put it in context. This was 40 years after they have left Kadesh Barnea, right? So this is what Moses is saying. And in the 40th year, counting from when? 40th year since when? Since they left Kadesh Barnea, or since they were in the Mount Horeb for how many years? About 2 years. Is that right? About 2 years. So maybe this is counting from the time that they left Egypt, because in Egypt, when they first left the first Passover, God told them this will be for you the beginning of month. So maybe that's the counting, right? So I thought just mention that. Now in verse 4, you have this mention of Kings Sihon and Og, right? King Sihon and Og of Heshbon and Bashan. So again, a bit of geography, just so that we can get oriented. Where is Sihon and Bashan? That would be places round about here, I would say, right? Over here, north of Edom, all the way up to modern day Golan Heights, which is, I guess you could say, east of the Kinneret, east of the Sea of Galilee, maybe northeast. So it's this entire region here that's being discussed, right? Okay, well, let me see. You've got questions, you can also send that in too. But Og and Bashan, they were a little bit special. Later on, you discover they are being mentioned as being the Rephaim, right? And they are giants. So that's really interesting. Okay, so maybe we'll talk a bit more about giants. But Rephaim also means ghosts, right? Ghosts or dead spirits, I suppose you could call it that. But clearly, these kings are not ghosts or dead spirits. So, I suppose we can skip that interpretation, right? Okay, let's just kind of continue from 6 so that we can make quick time.
Deuteronomy 1 verse 6. The Lord our God spoke to us in Horeb, saying, You have dwelt long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey and go to the mountains of the Amorites, to all the neighboring places in the plain, in the mountains and in the lowland, in the south and on the sea coast, to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates.
Okay, let's kind of pause there for real quick. The great river, right? The great river Euphrates. So you think about the size of the land. It extends from where is the great river Euphrates? That's like in modern day Iraq, right? So you compare that to where you see modern day Israel, the plot of land is really small. It only extends to that little river Jordan. But it's really strange, to think about this. God has given them the land. The boundaries of the land is actually much, much, much bigger. All the way north, all the way south, and all the way east, right? So that's worth thinking about. How do we think about that? And sometimes we don't fully know, and maybe something that you can think about, right? A land that God has given in, and now they are to go in to possess that land. I think it's verse 8. It says, I've set this land before you, go and possess the land. So the land wasn't dropped into their laps. It's something that I guess same as all of God's promises given to us, promised to us, but you still actually have to do the active work in going in to possess this land. Okay, let's kind of look at verse 9 here. Verse 9. Have we gotten through verse 9 yet? Okay, so let's just kind of read 8 and 9.
Deuteronomy 1 verse 9. And I spoke to you at that time, saying, I alone am not able to bear you. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and here you are today, as the stars of heaven in multitude. May the Lord God of our fathers make you 1,000 times more numerous than you are, and bless you as he has promised you. How can I alone bear your problems and your burdens and your complaints? Choose wise, understanding, and knowledgeable men from among your tribes, and I will make them heads over you. And you answered me and said, the thing which you have told us to do is good. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise and knowledgeable men, and made them heads over you, leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s, leaders of tens, and officers of your tribes.
Okay, let's kind of talk about this for. There's something really interesting here. I don't know if you noticed that. Of course, many of you will know that this is probably a reference back to Exodus chapter 18, right? Sometimes what we call the advice of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, right? So what is so interesting and I guess curious about me about this text as I read it, it says, Moses says, how does he say it? Let's see, in verse 9, right? He says, and I spoke to you at that time, saying, I alone am not able to bear you, right? And then verse 12, let's see, what does he say in verse 12? How can I alone bear your burdens and your complaints? Therefore choose. Now, it's kind of interesting, right? He never mentions Jethro here, right? Because in the original story, it was actually Jethro who told Moses that you cannot bear it. But, I guess 40 years later, maybe you take credit for... I guess we're all humans, right? Sometimes after 40 years, things sound a bit different and you kind of make the story. I don't know, maybe, I guess this is Moses. I better don't say too much about Moses. But, that is something, by the way, as you go through this text, you'll find happens quite a few times. I don't know whether it's because, memory fades. And it's true for all of us, After 40 years, when we think about your own childhood, everything sounds so much more heroic, Yeah, but, when you're going through it, it doesn't quite sound like that. But you will see that there's also some of this kind of stuff going on in this text here, and it gets more interesting as you go along, right? So Moses basically was supposed to focus on teaching the law of God, right? And instead of trying to spend all this time judging these people. And in verse 13, it says, how can I alone bear your burdens? Choose therefore wise and understanding, and I will make them heads over you. And you answered, the thing which you told us to do is good, right? So it is the people who chose leaders over themselves. If you look back in Exodus chapter 18, verse 20, can we just look at Exodus chapter 18, verse 20 real quick? Exodus chapter 18, 20, it says, this is actually Moses' father-in-law speaking, right? Let them judge. Verse 24, Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law, did all he had said. Moses chose able people, so they judged. Yeah, I guess it doesn't have the details as much here. Okay, well, never mind. We can we'll visit this again when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 16, right? But maybe we should just move on to the actual laws. Verse 17.
Deuteronomy 1 verse 17. You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be afraid in any man's presence, for the judgment is God's. The case that is too hard for you, bring to me, and I will hear it.
Okay, this is really quite good to discuss because it says, you shall not show partiality. And this bit about you shall not show partiality is actually something quite interesting for us as Asians, because the Hebrew word for this is actually lo takiru panim, means you should not give face, right? So we Asians, we like face. So Moses is actually saying when you judge a person, you shall not give face. You should not look at who the person is. There's this statue of Lady Justice, and she has a blindfold across her eyes, meaning that she judges, she doesn't care who it is, whether it's a big, an important person or a poor person who's coming. She judges on the merits of the case. I think this is basically what Moses is basically trying to say, right? You should not give face. And of course, we find in James chapter 2, verse 9, same thing. It says that you should not show partiality. If you show partiality, it means you give preference, say, to a wealthy person in your church, let him sit in front, and then the poor people, you just push them off to the back. If you do this, James says you're committing a sin, right? So Moses actually is saying that this is the law of God. You cannot show partiality. And sometimes I have to wonder whether we are as careful about not showing partiality. Colossians chapter 3, verse 25, and 1 Timothy chapter 5, 21, for those of you interested. Paul says, I charge you, right, in regarding to accusations that people bring, to show no prejudice or partiality. So when someone comes and tell you something, right, such and such a person did this, well, you cannot be thinking that, oh, this is my friend, or this is someone who I'm very familiar with, so I will listen to him. You're actually not allowed to do this by the law of Moses. It says no. You are supposed to listen to the objectively to the merits of the matter. And sometimes, as humans, we are like, we want to take the side of our friend, right? Or we want to take the side of the person who seems to be showing you favor or giving you a benefit. So all that New Testament stuff really comes back to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 17, right? Feelings, vested interests, all this should not be allowed to cloud our decision making, because God himself doesn't show partiality. Okay, whether he does or not, we will discuss this later on, right? And we will have this again in Deuteronomy chapter 17, in chapter 10 and verse 16, right? But it also says here, if you do not know how to judge a matter, right? If you do not know how to judge a matter, which I think is very realistic, because very often we do not know what to do. In my own life, there's lots of times where I do not know what to do. And what are you supposed to do when you do not know what to do, right? And Moses says here, the case that's too hard to you, bring to me. So now you have all these people who are, tasked with judging. If they do not know what to do, they refer upwards. Okay, so they'll pass it upstream. And if they don't know, they keep going up until finally it gets to Moses, right? So the question is, what about Moses? What happens if he doesn't know what to do? What does he will ask God, right? I mean, Moses is kind of special. He goes to see God, has this appointment with God from time to time. But afterwards, you discover that in the time of being in the land, and Moses was no longer around, they will actually go to the priest. And what the priest would do is the priest would actually take the Urim and Thummim, right? So these are the two stones, and I think we'll talk about that later on. But basically, they will seek God, right? So I think for all of us, I think the reality first is that there are lots of times when we actually don't know what to do. I think it's kind of arrogant to pretend that we will know the answer to everything, right? Or you can just pull out the Bible and quote a verse for everything. In fact, many times we will not know what to do. And when we do not know what to do, Moses is saying, just refer upwards until finally you turn to God and say, God, I do not know what to do. Help me know your will in this. And God who hears will answer us, right? So that's really what is kind of saying in verse 17 and 18. Let's continue with verse 18.
Deuteronomy 1:18. And I commanded you at that time all the things which you should do. So we departed from Horeb and went through all that great and terrible wilderness which you saw on the way to the mountains of the Amorites, as the Lord our God had commanded us. Then we came to Kadesh Barnea, and I said to you, you have come to the mountains of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. Look, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up and possess it, as the Lord God of your fathers has spoken to you. Do not fear or be discouraged. And every one of you came near to me and said, let us send men before us, and let us search out the land for us, and bring back word to us of the way by which we should go up, and the cities into which we shall come. The plan pleased me well, so I took 12 of your men, one man from each tribe, and they departed and went up into the mountains, and came to the valley of Eshcol, and spied it out. They also took some of the fruit of the land in their hands and brought it down to us. And they brought back word to us, saying, "It is a good land, which the Lord our God is giving us."
Okay, so couple of things here. First of all, this is again a very familiar story. Moses is now reminding all these, I guess, not so young people anymore, what happened to their father's generation, right? And he says, right, he says that, well, back then, verse 22 and 23, he says, every one of you came near to me and said, let us send men before us. Okay, so the people wanted to send spies. Think about this for a second, right? This is what it's saying, right? The people came to Moses and said, let us send these spies into the land, right? Is that what happened? Right. But now, okay, let's just have maybe Mark, can you read Numbers chapter 13, verse 1 and 2?
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them.
Okay, this is interesting, isn't it? Because here it says, whose idea was it? God told Moses, you send men. But 40 years later, I think probably, like I said, it must be having a heart in the wilderness, It's I have problem remembering stuff, okay? I don't know. I mean, I'm just looking at the text, and this is what we are doing. We're just looking at the text and letting the text speak for itself. Trying to understand it within its historical context. But I'm looking at this and thinking, no, that's not what happened, right? But I guess after 40 years, or maybe Moses was sort of like summarizing. Okay, so let's just give him the benefit of the doubt. He's sort of summarizing, or maybe he's sort of like smoothing out the story a little bit, right? So it was originally God, well, at least depending on which one you want to look, but Deuteronomy is coming much later. So let's say originally will be the earlier record in Numbers, right? I think that's very funny for me. In any case, the spies came out on the land, and they went out to check out the land, right? Okay, let's kind of continue with 26.
Deuteronomy 1:26. Nevertheless, you would not go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. 27. And you complained in your tents and said, because the Lord hates us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites
And
to destroy us.
28 as well.
Where can we go up? Our brethren have discouraged our hearts, saying, the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. Moreover, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there.
But it really says here, right? Nevertheless, when you rebelled against God, okay, that you have bitterness. So the Hebrew is really interesting in this regard. Let me take a quick look at the Hebrew here. It says, you are not willing, Lord Avitem, Lord, you are not willing to go up, and you rebel against the mouth of Jehovah. Okay, that's what it says. You rebel against. Of course, the mouth is where the command comes out from, right? So that's why it really is figurative language. When you rebel against the mouth of God, you're actually rebelling against His command, and you complain. Now, this bit here is actually you whispered in your tents. Okay, that's kind of interesting to me, because they whisper in their tent. They were not like out in the open complaining against God. They were actually probably just whispering among themselves, oh, that was terrible. Why did Moses do this and do that? They were, what's most interesting is that God heard them. I mean, for all of us complainers out there, right? And I don't know what it is that we might be complaining about, but the thing is that God hears us. Actually in Malachi, if I'm not wrong, there's, it talks about a book that's written about everything that is said, that we say to one another. No, I don't think that's an actual book like that, but it is something to remind us of when we, feeling inclined to make a complaint, right? That God actually hears, and God heard them, right? And it was not good for them. So maybe we can just continue reading on from there.
Deuteronomy 1:29. Then I said to you, do not be terrified or afraid of them. The Lord your God, who goes before you, he will fight for you according to all he did for you in Egypt before your eyes, and in the wilderness where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, as a man carries his son, in all the way that you went until you came to this place.
Okay, let's kind of pause there real quick. There's just so many gems in this that are so interesting that we don't normally discuss in sermons. But as a man carries, that's a beautiful picture. As a man carries his son, and this picture, of course, is this father who carries the son on your shoulders. You know, I mean, some of you, you've got your own kids, right? And when they're young, of course, not when they're old, but when they're young, you just put them across your shoulders, and you can. And that really is the picture here. And God carries this son out of out of Egypt. But then later on, you can see in Hosea chapter 11, it also uses this image, right? Hosea chapter 11, it says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called him, right? And of course, you have many other imageries like this in Exodus chapter 19, verse 4. It says, I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself, right? The Hosea one is interesting because this is talking about a rebellious son, right? This rebellious son, but God carried him on the shoulder lovingly out of Egypt. But of course, Matthew chapter 2, verse 15 applies this to Jesus, right? So that's a lot to be discussed in how does Matthew see this rebellious son, then, apply that as a prophecy to Jesus. But we don't have time to discuss that particular very interesting discussion today. I'm just looking quickly at the questions. Are the sons of Anakim giants? Yeah, they are. Okay, there's this very interesting discussion about who the giants were, and the Bible has some details. Basically, those details come from Genesis chapter 7, maybe 6 or 7, right? 6 or 7. It talks about these sons of God who came down and took wives of these women, and they gave birth to what is called the great men of great renown, right? And later on, these people came to be called Nephilim, right? And then if you look in the Bible, you can actually find that the Nephilim are the progenitors of all this whole, race of giants, the Anakim, the Rephaim, there's quite a number of others, the Emim, and quite a number of these people. And these were known as giants. Later on, you discover some descriptions, particularly of, I think it's Og of Bashan, right, the king. He's described a little bit about just how big they are. So we will come to that. Let me see any other questions. Okay.
There's a question. Did Moses have a scribe who maybe made the mistake?
Oh, well.
I believe that's with regards to
the recounting.
The recounting, yeah.
Yeah, well, either way you have problems, right? I mean, first of all, the scribe, if he had a scribe, it's most likely Joshua, because half the time he was in the presence of God, right? The scribe would have been struck dead. So he couldn't have been much of a scribe. But Joshua was there a lot. He would have written these things. Maybe in his rewriting, he sort of like recast the whole thing in a nicer light, right? Just in the same way, if we were to rewrite our histories, we will make ourselves heroes in the histories, right? I mean, that's just human nature. So yeah, it could have been that. But of course, the tradition has it that Moses himself wrote this without a scribe. That's the tradition. But I think that's a good question. And of course, scholars today, they are not completely agreed as to the how the authorship of these books of the Torah came about. Some people believe, okay, the first 5 books traditionally ascribed to Moses, right? But clearly there are some parts which Moses could not have written, right? When you get to the end of Deuteronomy, it says, Moses was buried on Mount Nebo. Now, clearly Moses could not have come out from the grave and wrote that bit, right? So there has to be some other people. And there's also, if you look into more, scholarly literature, you find this discussion of something known as the documentary hypothesis, right? That now this part of the Torah is written by some people, this were written by the priests, this were written by some other scribes. And, I try not to get into too much of all that. I'm aware of this documentary hypothesis, but I think for all intents and purposes, however this contents come out, I like to believe that these are the words that God spoke to Moses. Now, the process of transmission, we can debate about it. I'm more of pragmatist. I'm less concerned with how the text gets to us, but I'm more interested in what the text was supposed to be. Right. So I think these are largely the words of Moses, right? Barring a couple of little, I guess, transmission or recording of different hands that are involved. Somehow these words are preserved for us as the words of Moses, and that to me is what's important, right? So, scribe or not, I don't know, right? Okay, there's a question here
There's another
also about
question.
the
Does
flood.
that mean
Right?
that the flood did not wipe out the giants?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've asked this before, right? Because if you look, let me see. Actually, I wrote down something here. So let's see the moon. I tell you what, we are going to talk about some of these giants later, right? So why don't we keep that for the future? Because there's a lot more to be said about the giants. But yeah, you would have thought that the flood wiped out everyone. Actually, it says in Genesis that every living thing, including birds, were wiped out as a flood. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but maybe they just had nowhere to land, no food to eat. So it must have been long enough to kill them, right? So we will get to that discussion, although it's not really a discussion about Deuteronomy, right? So I'm trying to kind of keep it focused on Deuteronomy. So let's just kind of press on a little bit here. Okay.
Deuteronomy 1, verse 32. Yet, for all that, you did not believe the Lord your God, who went in the way before you to search out a place for you to pitch your tents, to show you the way you should go, in the fire by night and in the cloud by day. And the Lord heard the sound of your words and was angry, and took an oath, saying, Surely not one of these men, of this evil generation, shall see that good land of which I swore to give to your fathers, except Caleb, the son of Jenupe. He shall see it.
Okay, Jephunneh, by the way.
Jephunneh.
Yeah, he shall see.
And to him and his children, I am giving the land on which he walked, because he wholly followed the Lord.
Okay, this actually, I know it's not the end of chapter yet, because this chapter 1 is really long, right? But a couple of things here, again, worth mentioning. When it says God was angry, I always wonder, how did they come to the conclusion that God was angry, right? And I mean, they can't see God, so they have to judge from the effects, right? Maybe the punishment, the outcome, and in that way, they concluded that God was angry. Sometimes God would tell Moses, tell them I'm angry, right? But this word angry, right, is actually very interesting for those of you who are interested in Hebrew. This word comes from the word af, right? Angry. And af actually means the nose, right? So what happens is that in Hebrew, it's a pictorial language. When someone is angry, their nose flares, you see, right? The nose flares. So it means that God is angry, right? And other places it says God was very patient, so the nose is very long. Okay, so I know there's different pictures nowadays. You think about Pinocchio, there's a different picture, but it is a very, very pictorial language, Hebrew. And I think where I can, maybe I'll just kind of point out some of these things. Maybe the other thing that's worth mentioning was this comment about Caleb, and he's described as one who has wholly followed Jehovah, right? Yes, wholly and completely followed God, as opposed to in verse 35, you have surely out of these men of this evil generation. By the way, this is the first time the word evil is used in Deuteronomy. And so, what is evil in the eyes of God? Right? In the eyes of God, disobedience is evil. Unbelief is actually evil, right? So when we think evil, it's not talking about vampires or ghosts or demons. For God, evil is actually disobedience, right? That is God's yardstick. So what is wholly followed? The Caleb's wholly following. That's good, right? So the opposite of evil and good. So Caleb is the opposite of these people. The people had unbelief. The people disobeyed. Caleb believed. Caleb obeyed, and that really is, I think, the yardstick. And the other verse that we kind of skip over, it says, verse 33, who went in the way before you to search out a place. Okay, this is talking about God. So God goes before you to search out a place. That's interesting. Lator, Lakem, Makom, to search out a place. And the word search is, search. Now here's the thing. why does God need to search out the place? You would have thought that God already decided on the place, right? So why does it actually use this rather curious term? It's as if God was going out and let's see what is a good place for these guys, right? You would think that God knew exactly where the place was, already mark out the territory and so on and so forth. And well, I think one way, again, it's a good time to talk about some of the anthropomorphisms, right? When the people write these things, they're writing from, I guess, from a human perspective of how they understand what God is doing. Yeah, indeed, God knows everything. But from a human point of view, you write in such a way that makes sense to them, right? God is angry. Okay, well, that's how they see it. Whether God is in fact, angry in the way we are, has his emotions, feeling upset, and can you imagine that whole day God cannot sleep, it's not exactly the same as the way we are angry, right? And so you see some of these anthropomorphic words going on in God says, the Lord heard your sound of your words and he was angry. Right? He took an oath. He swore, right? He swore saying, surely none of these people. Of course, we know that story and we know how that ended. Yep, let's have a look at the question.
Actually, there's two.
Okay.
Why only given to Caleb? Didn't
Mm.
Joshua also went into the promised land?
Yeah. I mean,
the other
later on,
one-
you read later on. You mentioned Joshua. Okay, so Joshua gets his part, but frankly, I think Caleb was really the outstanding one. Joshua was sort of like the natural successor to Moses. I think really Caleb stands out. Is really being highlighted as the one that we should emulate, right? But I want to go to verse 37. I know there's some questions, but we'll come to that later. But just look at verse 37. It's another interesting thing that's relevant, right?
Verse 37.
And 8.
The Lord was also angry with me for your sakes, saying, even you shall not go in there. Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall go in there. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it.
Okay, so here's really interesting, right? Moses is saying that, the reason I cannot get into this promised land is why? Because you guys, God was angry with me for your. Wait a minute, this is not what happened, is it? I mean, you look at Numbers chapter 20, verse 12, right? Just kind of real quickly look at Numbers chapter. This is what I mean by, okay, the scribal thing, right? Numbers chapter, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Right? Very clearly, the problem was Moses and Aaron. Okay, I kind of Aaron. Well, I don't know what Aaron did, or probably what he didn't do. But Moses was the one. And how did he not hallow God? How did he not honor God? By striking the rock when God actually say, speak to the rock, right? So he struck the rock. So what happened was he disobeyed God in front of people. So, there's a lot to be said about that, God is concerned about how he is honored and revered in front of people, which really for many of us, who are trying to live out our Christian lives as a testimony is actually quite important, because God is something important to God. But in any case, the fault was clearly, at least in Numbers chapter 20, verse 12, with Moses. But now we get to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 37. The story kind of changes a little bit, isn't it? I mean, it's like, I really don't want to say too much about this, but, I'll let you decide for yourself what you think is going on there. But I do find it really quite interesting that there's a bit of this revisionism, right? I guess it's all in our human nature to blame someone else, isn't it? Right? Well, that's also another example of God being impartial. Moses was like, there's no prophet like Moses, right? Before, after him, who spoke to God face to face. And yet, when he dishonored God, it's one rule for all, right? There's no special exception for Moses, just because, he was more familiar with God. And I think that's a point for all of us as Christians to really be careful not to become complacent in our walk with God. That, it's, I know God, I can just do whatever. No, when it comes to observing the laws of God, it's basically one rule for all, at least for this, okay?
Verse 39. Moreover, your little ones and your children, who you say will be the victims, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there. To them I will give it, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn and take your journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. Then you answered and said to me, We have sinned against the Lord. We will go up and fight, just as the Lord our God commanded us. And when every one of you had girded on his weapons of war, you were ready to go up into the mountain. And the Lord said to me, Tell them, do not go up nor fight, for I am not among you.
Okay, let's kind of pause that reading just there, real quick, just give you an idea because it talks about this, the way of the sea, right? So if you look at this map over here, I have, I know it's all in Hebrew, but I'll just tell you, these are ancient, I guess you could say, trade routes, okay, how people travel from place to place. And of course, this is, I guess this is Canaan, and those guys were out over here in the Transjordan across from Jericho. And there was a river, there was not a river, there was a highway here, right? This one here, the red color one, it's called the I can't see, Hamalek. This is called the King's Highway, right? So the King's Highway, and this highway actually leads down all the way to the Red Sea, right? So I'm thinking they were up here, they were told to turn and probably take this highway and go down, right? This will probably take them back to where they came from before that. And that's the way I would see. I thought I'd just mention it to you. There are several major highways that come into discussion from time to time, but this red one is where they are, right? Go by on the east of Edom, all the way down to Elat, modern day Elat, and down to the Red Sea. Okay, so let's sort of like continue. Right?
Lest you be defeated before your enemies. Verse 43. So I spoke to you, yet you would not listen, but rebelled against the command of the Lord, and presumptuously went up into the mountain.
Okay, just pause. What is this word presumptuously? Right? So the Hebrew word is Zod, like the alien race. No, the Superman bad guy, right? Was it called Zod? No, it's like super. Okay, never mind. We're not talking about Superman here, but I thought his name was called Zod. Zod actually means proud, right? Humble. So instead of being, by the way, this is like Superman, like early version of Superman. So probably you guys don't know about it, but I think sometimes we act proudly or at least presumptuously, meaning that instead of following God, we think we know better. That's what this word presumptuously means, right? And it is a sin of presumption, happens a lot in the Bible, right? So basically too clever for their own good, right? So now because of that, the children of Israel, they decided that they're going to take the land anyway, after God said, now it's too late, the window is past, and turn back, but they said, okay, no, we changed our mind. Well, God has changed his mind. So they went up and they were defeated, right? Now, verse 45, it says that they wept, right? They wept, but God would not listen to your voice nor give ear to you. Wow. Look at that. God would not listen to their weeping. Someone asked me if God listened to every prayer, right? I suppose God listens to every prayer, but he can clearly, and he does clearly ignore the cries of the disobedient. Right? When you don't listen to God, God is under no obligation to listen to us. Sometimes we treat God as, well, we'll turn to God anytime we are ready. When we don't need God, we'll just do our own thing, right? God will not be treated that way. Of course, we remember 2 Chronicles chapter 14, which says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, right? Turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and heal their land. So God has never been obliged to answer or praise. And really, you begin to see a picture of God is being described to these children of Israel by Moses. Moses is trying to help them to understand who God is, right? What God's behavior, God's antics are. Almost at verse 46. Okay, so it says, and you remain in Kadesh. So they went back to that place where they kind of started off a little bit for many days, right? According to days that you spend there. And they were at Kadesh in this place called near Homa, probably in Edom. That's somewhere in Edom. So Edom is just on the east of the Dead Sea, right? So today, if you go, you might be around the area of Petra, the mountains. You can see the mountains there. Or maybe in the wilderness of Zin around the Negev, right? But I am more inclined to think it's towards the east. So they stayed there for quite a long time. They didn't stay in one spot, they wandered around that area, right? And Joshua chapter 15, verse 1 to 3 suggests that it was east of Edom. That's why I said east of the Arava. Numbers chapter 34, verse 3 says that it's the wilderness of Zin. And Numbers chapter 20 has a record of this. So you can read some of this for yourselves, right? Now, it says, so you remain in Kadesh for many days. That's interesting, right? Moses is talking to that same generation. Why didn't he say, we remain in Kadesh for many days? So again, there's whole clue that maybe the writer has problems switching back and forth his character and what he's trying to transcribe, right? So it's quite interesting. Okay, we are chapter 2, but we are way into the time, so we're going to call this, the end of this particular episode, and we're going to continue this very exciting journey through this. Now, forgive us if things are not as smooth, because this is really our first time trying to do this thing, but we hope you join us again, like every couple of mornings, and we can look in the Bible, all right? So, God bless you, shalom, and we'll see you tomorrow.
We hope you enjoyed studying the Word of God. Join us again as we continue through the book of Devarim.